January 17, 1945. The skies above Luzon, Philippines. The air trembled with the sound of twin radial engines. C-47 Skitrans moved through the tropical sky in rigid formation, their olive-drab fuselages cutting through wisps of cloud at 800 feet. Below, the sugarcane fields stretched across the island like a patchwork quilt stitched with irrigation ditches and narrow roads. Japanese observers hidden in the tree line raised their field glasses, tracking the American transports as they approached from the south. The aircraft flew lower than any bomber formation they had seen, dangerously low, impossibly low. Then the doors opened. From the bellies of those transports, white silk mushrooms began to bloom against the pale morning sky. Not dozens. Hundreds. The paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division descended in clusters so tight they seemed choreographed, their canopies filling the air like cherry blossoms in a spring storm. Japanese machine gunners opened fire immediately, their Type 92 heavy machine guns chattering from concealed positions along the ridgeline. Tracers arced upward, bright orange needles threading through the morning light. Yet the Americans kept coming. The formations did not scatter. The drops did not falter. Each man descended exactly where he was meant to, exactly when he was meant to, into a landing zone swept by enemy fire. Captain Yukio Matsuda, commanding a defensive position near Tagate Ridge, watched through his binoculars with an expression that his aide would later describe as bewilderment. In his 2 years fighting across the Pacific, Matsuda had seen American bombers drop their payloads from 20,000 feet, seen naval gunfire pummel beaches from beyond visual range. But this was different. This was controlled violence. This was precision under fire. The Americans were falling from the sky in perfect order while bullets tore the air around them, and not one formation broke. Not one transport deviated. The discipline was absolute. What Captain Matsuda did not know, what he could not have known, was that those paratroopers represented the culmination of 3 years of brutal lessons learned from North Africa to Normandy. Every jump pattern, every equipment modification, every timing sequence had been purchased with blood and refined through failure. The precision he witnessed was not accidental. It was engineered. 4 years earlier, Japanese military planners had studied American airborne operations with the clinical detachment of scientists examining a flawed prototype. The reports that crossed general staff desks in Tokyo painted American paratroopers as well-equipped but poorly trained, their drops chaotic, their casualties from landing alone sometimes exceeding 20%. Intelligence summaries from German allies confirmed this assessment. The Americans, it seemed, had built an airborne corps on industrial might rather than tactical excellence. They had the equipment but lacked the warrior spirit. They had the aircraft but not the discipline. This assessment was not entirely unfair. The early American airborne drops had been disasters dressed in propaganda. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, saw paratroopers scattered across 40 miles of hostile territory, shot down by friendly naval fire, and drowned in the Mediterranean when strong winds carried them into the sea. Of the 3,400 men of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment who boarded aircraft that night, fewer than half assembled at their designated objectives. The 82nd Airborne's after-action report used words like scattered, confused, and ineffective. German observers noted with satisfaction that American airborne doctrine prioritized speed over accuracy, quantity over quality. But the Japanese military planners made a critical error. They mistook early American failures for permanent American limitations. They assumed that a nation born of democratic comfort could never master the iron discipline required for airborne warfare. They believed that soldiers raised on abundance and individualism would break under the pressure of dropping into enemy fire. This was the prevailing wisdom in Japanese military academies, where instructors taught that American prosperity had bred softness, that their industrial advantage masked spiritual weakness. The men of the 11th Airborne Division descending over Luzon that January morning were living proof of how wrong that wisdom was. Lieutenant Haruo Nakamura crouched in a foxhole on the northern edge of the drop zone, his Nambu pistol gripped in sweating hands. He had been ordered to observe and report, not to engage unless directly threatened. Through the drifting gun smoke, he watched the American paratroopers land. What he saw violated everything he had been taught about airborne operations. They landed in sequence. First came the pathfinders, marked by colored panels on their helmets, who hit the ground running and immediately began setting up radio beacons. Within 90 seconds, They had established a command post and were transmitting landing coordinates to the follow-on waves. The second wave came in 60 seconds later, not scattered across miles of terrain but concentrated within a 400-yard radius. Nakamura counted the seconds between impacts. 12 men per minute. 24. 36. The mathematics of it was staggering. Each C-47 disgorged its complement of paratroopers in precise intervals, the spacing calculated to prevent mid-air collisions while maintaining formation integrity on the ground. When they landed, they did not stumble or fumble with equipment. They executed what Nakamura would later describe in his report as a choreographed violence. Each man knew his role. Automatic riflemen moved immediately to perimeter positions, their Browning automatic rifles already shouldered. Riflemen formed into fire teams without verbal commands. Radio men unspooled antenna wire while simultaneously scanning for threats. The transformation from falling object to fighting force took less than 3 minutes. Nakamura had seen Japanese paratroopers train for similar operations at Shirai Airfield. It had taken them 12 minutes under ideal conditions, with no enemy fire. The Americans were doing it under a hailstorm of bullets. What Lieutenant Nakamura could not see, what became apparent only through captured documents and post-war interviews, was the obsessive training regimen that produced such precision. After the failures in Sicily and the mixed results in Normandy, the U.S. Army Air Forces and Airborne Command had conducted a ruthless analysis of every jump casualty, every missed objective, every scattered formation. They had identified 47 distinct points of failure in the drop sequence, from aircraft spacing to parachute deployment to landing techniques. Each failure point was addressed through training, equipment modification, or tactical adjustment. Pilots now flew standardized approach patterns, maintaining exactly 110 miles per hour at exactly 800 feet altitude. Deviations of 5 miles per hour or 50 feet were considered failures. Paratroopers trained with a T-5 parachute until they could land and shed their harness in under 20 seconds. They practiced assembly drills until they could form a combat-ready squad in pitch darkness with only sound and touch. They jumped in every weather condition short of typhoon, at every hour, until the act of falling from a moving aircraft became as routine as boarding a bus. The 11th Airborne Division had logged over 200 training jumps before arriving in the Philippines. Some veterans had jumped more than 40 times. They knew the peculiar physics of descent, how to compensate for wind, how to spot landing zones from altitude, how to prepare their body for the impact that came like a punch from the earth itself. This was not warrior spirit in the mystical sense that Japanese military doctrine revered. This was industrial-scale repetition creating muscle memory so deep it operated below conscious thought. The symbolism of the parachute itself became a point of fixation in Japanese military analysis. Post-battle intelligence reports devoted entire paragraphs to describing the American silk canopies. They were not simple hemispheres but engineered systems with 28 individual panels, each cut to precise specifications. The suspension lines were not rope but nylon, a synthetic material that Japan's resource-starved industry could not reproduce in equivalent quality or quantity. Each parachute represented 17 hours of labor and enough raw material to manufacture 3 uniforms. The Americans were dropping thousands of them. To Japanese soldiers watching from the jungle, each white canopy became a symbol of American material abundance. They were fighting a war with dwindling supplies, wearing uniforms patched beyond recognition, eating rice rations cut twice in the past year. Many had not received new boots in 18 months. Their parachutes, when they manufactured them at all, were made of silk diverted from kimonos, so precious that training jumps were limited to officers. The average Japanese paratrooper jumped 3 times before being declared operational. The Americans jumped until they were bored with it. But it was not merely the abundance that stunned Japanese observers. It was the precision with which that abundance was deployed. Captain Matsuda, observing from Tagate Ridge, noted in his field journal that the Americans appeared to have infinite confidence in their equipment. They did not hesitate before jumping. They did not check their parachutes obsessively like Japanese troops did. They simply stood, hooked their static lines, and stepped into the void as if boarding a train. This casual confidence, Matsuda wrote, was more demoralizing than any weapon. It spoke to a deeper truth. These men expected their equipment to work because it always had. They trusted their system because their system had proven trustworthy. This trust extended beyond equipment to doctrine. American airborne operations followed a standardized playbook refined through repeated iteration. Pathfinders jumped first, always. They established drop zones and radio beacons, always. Follow-on waves arrived in sequence, always. Each wave had a specific mission: secure perimeter, establish command post, locate and assemble supply bundles, prepare for link-up with ground forces. There was no improvisation because improvisation introduced chaos, and chaos killed. The 11th Airborne operated like a factory, each component performing its designated function at its designated time. Japanese military culture, by contrast, emphasized individual initiative and warrior spirit. Commanders were expected to adapt to circumstances, to seize opportunities through bold action. This philosophy had served Japan well in the early war years, producing stunning victories through aggressive maneuver and surprise. But against an opponent who combined material superiority with procedural discipline, warrior spirit alone proved insufficient. You could not outspirit a system. Sergeant Ichiro Tanaka survived the American airborne assault on Luzon. In his post-war testimony to Allied interrogators, he described the moment the American precision became undeniable. His unit had established a defensive line along a tree-covered ridge overlooking the drop zone. They had clear fields of fire, pre-registered artillery support, and orders to inflict maximum casualties on the descending paratroopers. Tanaka commanded a Type 92 machine gun team, arguably the most effective small-unit weapon in the Japanese arsenal. They opened fire as the first wave of C-47s approached, sending streams of 7.7 mm rounds into the formation. "We hit them," Tanaka recalled. "I saw parachutes collapse. I saw men falling. But the formation did not break. The aircraft did not turn away. They continued as if we were shooting blanks." What Tanaka was witnessing was another facet of American airborne doctrine: acceptance of casualties as part of the operational calculus. U.S. airborne planners knew that men would die in the drop. They planned for it. Medical corpsmen jumped in every wave. Aid stations were prepositioned based on predicted casualty patterns. Evacuation procedures were established before the first man left the aircraft. The Americans had industrialized not just the mechanics of dropping soldiers from airplanes, but the entire logistics chain that supported them. They did not expect zero casualties. They expected manageable casualties that would not prevent mission accomplishment. This was a fundamentally different approach from Japanese military doctrine, which viewed each soldier's death as a sacred sacrifice requiring revenge. When an American paratrooper died in the drop, another immediately took his place in the formation. Roles were redundant. Responsibilities overlapped. The machine continued functioning. Japanese forces, operating with shrinking manpower and no prospect of reinforcement, could not afford such redundancy. Every casualty degraded their combat effectiveness. The Americans, paradoxically, had built a system where individual deaths mattered less because the collective mattered more. Tanaka's machine gun team fired until their barrel overheated. They changed barrels and fired again. They exhausted their primary ammunition and began firing reserves. Still the Americans came. When the last C-47 finally turned away and the sky emptied of parachutes, Tanaka counted over 400 men on the ground below. He estimated his team had killed perhaps 8. The mathematics were crushing. At that rate, they would run out of ammunition long before the Americans ran out of men. The precision of American airborne drops was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a psychological weapon. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with American paratroopers consistently reported a sense of inevitability, a feeling that resistance was futile against an opponent who could project force with such mechanical certainty. This demoralization appears repeatedly in captured diaries and interrogation reports. A private from the 8th Division wrote, "They fall from the sky like rain. We shoot them and more come. Their machines do not tire. Their will does not break." This perception was reinforced by the material wealth visible in every captured supply bundle. When Japanese forces overran isolated American positions, they found equipment caches that seemed fantastical. Each paratrooper carried rations for 3 days, not rice and dried fish, but canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, instant coffee. Their first aid kits contained morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages of quality superior to what Japanese field hospitals possessed. They wore boots with synthetic soles that did not rot in tropical humidity. Their uniforms were impregnated with insect repellent. One Japanese soldier's diary, recovered near Nasugbu, described finding an American supply drop containing not just weapons and ammunition but also toilet paper, chewing gum, and paperback books. "They bring their entire civilization with them," the soldier wrote. "We are fighting not just their army but their way of life." This observation touched on a deeper truth about American airborne operations. The precision drops were not just about getting soldiers to the right place at the right time. They were about maintaining the American way of war, industrialized, logistically intensive, materially abundant. American paratroopers did not fight as light infantry improvising with what they could carry. They fought as mechanized troops temporarily separated from their machines, maintaining constant radio contact with supply aircraft, artillery support, and follow-on ground forces. The parachute drop was not isolation, it was projection. The transformation in Japanese thinking about American airborne capabilities did not happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion of confidence, a slow accumulation of evidence that contradicted doctrine. Even after Luzon, some Japanese officers insisted that American precision was illusory, that they simply dropped so many men that some were bound to land correctly. This willful denial persisted until June 1945, when the 11th Airborne conducted the final combat jump of the Pacific War at Apari. Colonel Hideaki Nakano, attached to Northern Luzon Area Army Headquarters, observed that jump from a hillside command post. His report to Manila headquarters was blunt: "The Americans have perfected airborne warfare. Their drops exhibit industrial precision. Resistance at the drop zone is futile. Recommend repositioning forces beyond immediate landing area and engaging after American forces disperse to objectives." This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese tactical thinking. They were no longer trying to defeat American airborne forces at the point of landing. They were accepting that the landing would succeed and planning for how to contest the aftermath. This was an acknowledgement of systematic inferiority, an admission that American training, equipment, and doctrine had produced a capability that Japan could not match. The irony was that American airborne forces achieved this dominance through the very characteristics that Japanese military culture considered weaknesses. They succeeded through standardization, which Japanese individualism rejected. They succeeded through material abundance, which Japanese spiritualism disdained. They succeeded through redundancy and systems thinking, which Japanese warrior culture viewed as unmanly. The precision that stunned Japanese observers was not born of superior warrior spirit but of superior organizational discipline, a discipline rooted in industrial culture, in the belief that human performance could be optimized through training, that complexity could be managed through procedure, that victory was a product of system rather than spirit. Among the American paratroopers themselves, the precision that so impressed Japanese observers was simply standard operating procedure. They did not consider their drops particularly remarkable. After-action reports from Luzon used language like successful jump and acceptable scatter pattern, clinical terms that gave no indication of the psychological impact on the enemy. The men of the 11th Airborne were not thinking about symbolic victory or ideological demonstration. They were thinking about landing without breaking an ankle, assembling with their squad, and moving to their objective before Japanese artillery found them. Private First Class Robert Chen, a radio operator with the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, described his experience jumping into Luzon in an oral history interview decades later. "You don't think about precision. You think about not getting tangled in your suspension lines. You count to 4 after you exit, check your canopy, find your rally point, hit the ground, shed your harness, weapon up, move. It's automatic. We trained so much it was boring." But boring meant alive. This mundane perspective highlights a key aspect of American military culture that Japanese planners consistently underestimated: the ability to make violence routine. American training doctrine aimed not to inspire warriors but to create competent professionals who executed tasks reliably under stress. The soldier was not an artist improvising combat, but a technician applying learned procedures. This approach lacked the romance of Bushido, the aesthetic appeal of warrior spirit. But it worked. The contrast became especially stark in airborne operations because every aspect of the jump sequence was measurable. Exit speed, canopy deployment time, descent rate, landing dispersion, rally time. American airborne units tracked these metrics obsessively, comparing performance across jumps, identifying outliers, adjusting training to address weaknesses. A paratrooper who consistently landed outside the designated zone received additional training until his performance matched the standard. There was no shame in this, no loss of honor. It was simply remediation, the same way a factory worker who produced defective parts received additional instruction. This data-driven approach extended to every element of airborne warfare. After each combat jump, analysts calculated drop patterns, measured distances from intended to actual landing zones, interviewed survivors about equipment failures. These findings fed back into training syllabi, equipment procurement, and doctrinal revisions. The system continuously improved itself, each operation providing data for the next. By the time the 11th Airborne jumped into Luzon, they were executing version 4.0 of American Airborne Doctrine, refined through 8 previous combat operations spanning 2 theaters. The recurring symbol that bound these operations together was the T-5 parachute itself. To American paratroopers, it was equipment, a tool, mundane in its familiarity. To Japanese soldiers, it became something more, a manifestation of American power, an object that represented not just technological superiority but systematic superiority. The T-5 embodied American manufacturing capacity, the ability to produce tens of thousands of identical items to exacting specifications. It embodied American supply chains, the ability to deliver those items across oceans to remote islands. It embodied American training systems, which taught tens of thousands of men to use those items with near-identical proficiency. Every white canopy descending over Luzon was a sermon in silk, preaching the gospel of industrial democracy. This was the lesson Japanese military observers struggled to articulate in their reports, that American precision was not an accident of training or temporary advantage in resources, but the natural expression of a social system organized around different principles. America had built an economy on standardization, efficiency, and mass production. When that economy mobilized for war, it produced not just tanks and aircraft but standardized procedures, mass-trained soldiers, and systematized violence. The American paratrooper was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He was a product of that system, as carefully manufactured as his parachute. Japanese soldiers captured after the Luzon campaign frequently mentioned the parachutes in their interrogations. Some described them with awe, others with resentment, a few with something approaching despair. They had been told that American soldiers were soft, that their prosperity had weakened them, that Japanese warrior spirit would prevail over American materialism. Then they watched those soft Americans fall from the sky in perfect formation while bullets sought them, land within yards of their intended targets, and form into combat units with the efficiency of clockwork. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Sergeant Tanaka, the machine gunner who survived the Luzon drop, addressed this directly in his post-war testimony. "We thought they won because they had more things. We did not understand they won because they had better systems. A parachute is not just silk. It is training, logistics, doctrine, trust. We could not copy the silk. We definitely could not copy the system." The broader implications of American airborne precision extended beyond the Philippines. Japanese military planners had anticipated that the invasion of the home islands would require massive airborne assaults. They had prepared accordingly, positioning reserve divisions near likely drop zones, stockpiling ammunition, training troops in anti-airborne tactics. But the success of American drops in the Philippines forced a recalculation. If the Americans could drop entire divisions with precision, if they could establish airheads faster than Japanese forces could respond, then the defense of Japan might be hopeless. This strategic despair contributed to the decision to accept surrender in August 1945. It was not the only factor, certainly not the primary one, but it was present in the background of military staff discussions. The Americans had demonstrated in battle after battle that they could project force with precision that Japanese forces could not contest. They had shown that their system, training, equipment, logistics, doctrine, produced battlefield results that individual courage could not overcome. The warrior spirit that Japanese military culture prized so highly had proven insufficient against an opponent who brought industrial discipline to warfare. The irony is that American soldiers would have rejected this characterization. They did not see themselves as avatars of industrial civilization. They saw themselves as doing a job, following orders, trying to stay alive. The precision that awed Japanese observers was, to them, simply doing things right because that's what training taught them. They jumped when told to jump, landed where they were supposed to land, assembled with their units, and moved to their objectives. It was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was professional. But professionalism, executed at scale with systematic precision, becomes its own form of overwhelming force. This was the lesson of American airborne operations in the Pacific, that democracy, properly organized, could produce military outcomes that autocracy could not match. Not through superior individual warriors, but through superior systems that made every warrior more effective. Not through warrior spirit, but through the spirit of engineering, which sought to remove randomness and uncertainty from combat. In the decades after the war, American airborne doctrine became the model for militaries worldwide. The techniques pioneered by the 82nd and 101st Airborne in Europe, refined by the 11th Airborne in the Pacific, spread to allied nations and former enemies alike. The precision that seemed so remarkable in 1945 became standard practice. Jump patterns were codified, published in field manuals, taught at military academies. The mystique faded. Precision became routine. Yet something was lost in that transformation, some element of the original achievement that cannot be fully captured in doctrine or procedure. The men who jumped into Luzon knew they were executing something extraordinary, even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe it. They were demonstrating that free citizens, trained and equipped by an industrial democracy, could match and exceed the performance of soldiers raised in totalitarian warrior cultures. They were proving that you did not need to worship death to embrace dangerous duty, that democratic society could produce its own form of martial excellence. Japanese military culture had assumed that warriors forged in hardship and sacrifice would naturally defeat soldiers raised in comfort. The Pacific War disproved that assumption. American paratroopers were not raised in hardship. They grew up with electricity, running water, public education, and 8-hour workdays. They came from a society that valued safety, prosperity, and individual rights. Yet when trained and organized systematically, they performed with precision that warriors raised in deprivation could not match. The comfort did not breed weakness. It bred confidence, the confidence that comes from living in a society where systems work, where institutions are reliable, where trust is warranted. That confidence manifested in the willingness to jump from an aircraft at 800 feet while people shot at you, trusting that your parachute would open, your equipment would function, your training would prove sufficient, and your comrades would be there when you landed. It was not blind faith. It was earned trust in a system that had demonstrated its reliability through thousands of iterations. This was the secret of American airborne precision, not superior courage, not warrior spirit, but justified confidence in systematic excellence. The sugarcane fields of Luzon are quiet now. The landing zones where the 11th Airborne descended are farmland again, worked by families who know little of what happened there. Occasional tourists visit, guided by fading markers and illustrated histories. The white parachutes are gone, degraded long ago into their component fibers. But the lesson remains. Precision under fire is not a gift granted to the naturally courageous. It is a product of training, doctrine, equipment, and trust, elements that can be engineered, systematized, taught. The Americans who fell from the sky over Luzon were not supermen. They were factory workers and farmhands, clerks and college students, organized into a system that made them greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. They jumped with precision not because they were fearless, but because fear had been drilled out through repetition, replaced with procedure and muscle memory. To the Japanese soldiers who watched those drops, the precision seemed almost supernatural, a manifestation of American material abundance so vast it translated into martial perfection. They were not entirely wrong. America's wealth did enable its military dominance. But wealth alone was insufficient. Nazi Germany possessed vast resources. Imperial Japan had controlled an empire. Both lost to an opponent who combined material abundance with systematic excellence, who understood that modern warfare was not an arena for warrior heroes but a complex problem requiring industrial solutions. The parachute became the symbol of this truth, not because it was particularly advanced technology, but because its successful deployment required so many systems working in harmony. Manufacturing, logistics, training, maintenance, doctrine, communications, meteorology, aviation, all had to function precisely for silk to deliver men safely to Earth. When it worked, when those systems aligned and hundreds of men descended in formation under fire, it demonstrated something profound about organized democracy, that free people, properly led and systematically trained, could achieve precision that tyranny could not match. This was the revelation that stunned Japan's airmen as they watched American paratroopers descend over Luzon. Not merely that Americans had better equipment, though they did. Not merely that Americans had more men, though they did. But that Americans had built systems that transformed ordinary citizens into precision instruments of war, systems that made the exceptional routine, that made courage manageable, that made democracy itself into a weapon more powerful than warrior spirit. The white parachutes blossoming in tropical sky were not just delivering soldiers. They were delivering a message written in silk and nylon and steel, that the future belonged not to warriors born in sacrifice, but to citizens trained in excellence. That precision under fire was not mystical but mechanical, not spiritual but systematic. That abundance properly organized was not weakness but strength. That democracy, for all its supposed softness, could produce fighting forces that totalitarianism could not defeat. The men who jumped that day did not know they were writing history. They knew only that their training said jump, so they jumped. That their doctrine said land here, so they landed there. That their system said form up and move out, so they did. The precision that awed their enemies was, to them, simply Tuesday. But sometimes Tuesday changes the world.